This is a copy of the contemporary statue of Queen Anne, placed in front of the splendid new cathedral of St. Paul's to celebrate its completion. The Queen herself came here in 1704 to lead the national service of thanksgiving for Blenheim, the great victory won over Louis XIV of France by her general, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough. The last monarch to come to St. Paul's for a victory service was Elizabeth I, and the parallels between the two queens were invoked in the celebrations. In personal terms, the comparison was absurd. Elizabeth was one of the most remarkable individuals ever to have worn a crown. Anne was an overweight, overwrought housewife. But in terms of the power of Anne's kingdom and Elizabeth's, the boot was on the other foot. Elizabeth's England had been too poor to fight continuous war abroad, but each year of Anne's reign brought fresh victories and another state procession to St. Paul's, until, by 1712, her kingdom was the greatest power of Europe. It had acquired a new name under which it would take its place on the world stage: Great Britain. Why did the England of Anne succeed, where the England of Elizabeth had finally failed? It did so because Anne was heir to the glorious revolution of 1688-89, which altered forever the relationship between Crown and Parliament. And in the quarter century which followed the revolution, England herself was transformed. "14 years before Anne became queen, her sister Mary and brother-in-law William arrived by barge here at Hampton Court. It was early in February 1689, and their arrival was the culmination of a sequence of extraordinary events. Less than 2 months earlier, Mary and Anne's father, the Roman Catholic king, James II, had fled the country after William had landed with an invasion force. Parliament had welcomed the Protestant William and his wife Mary with open arms. Just a few days before coming to Hampton Court, he and Mary had accepted the crown as joint monarchs, although all the power was vested in William. Now, here they were, the palace that Mary had last visited as a child. Hampton Court was soon to become their favourite house, a place they would make their own, with a massive building programme and many improvements. But just as the Tudor palace was to be remodelled dramatically, so too was the monarchy. For, though William and Mary wore the crown of their forebears, they represented a radical break from what had gone before. And within weeks of their arrival here, this break from tradition became explicit as they sought to escape from the quasi-religious rituals that hedged the divinity of the Tudor and Stuart kings. These centred on the Chapel Royal here and followed the ancient cycle of the church's calendar. A particularly important group clustered round the great feast of Easter, which in 1689 fell on the 31st of March. The first of these was the ceremony of Maundy Thursday. For centuries, on the day before Good Friday, the English monarch had reenacted the role of Christ after the Last Supper by bathing the feet of some carefully chosen paupers. William balked at this outlandish popish ceremony. He flatly refused to wash the feet of the poor and limited himself instead to giving them the traditional alms. William objected even more strongly to the ceremonies of Easter Sunday. By tradition, After solitary communion, the monarch would lay healing hands on a waiting crowd of invalids suffering from an illness known as the King's Evil, a disfiguring strain of tuberculosis. It was a ceremony on which Mary's father had been especially keen. James II had taken the practice of touching for the King's Evil, frankly, back to its medieval Catholic roots by reintroducing the old Latin liturgy. For William, this was to add superstitious idolatry to old-fashioned absurdity, and he suspended the practice entirely. God give you better health and more sense, he is supposed to have told the hopeful afflicted. William's refusal to continue the old rituals signalled to everyone that here was a different kind of king. For his Tudor and Stuart predecessors, the monarchy had been a sacred trust committed to them by God. But William was no believer in the divine nature of kingship. To a Calvinist like him, monarchy was a purely human institution. What William did believe in was predestination, or divinely ordained destiny. In particular, his own God-given mission to be the nemesis of Catholic France and of its overweeningly aggressive king, Louis XIV. And it is this mission which William is shown as achieving in this, the ceiling painted by Sir James Thornhill in the Painted Hall at Greenwich. Right in the centre of the painting, William sits enthroned, Mary to one side. Beneath William's feet cowers an emblematic figure of tyranny, a savage-looking portrait of Louis XIV. All around, crowns and papal tiaras topple. Here, in swirling imagery, is William's lifetime ambition. To become King of England was only a step towards this goal of crushing France and Louis XIV, and not an end in itself. This meant that what his predecessors had regarded as inalienable God-given rights, William saw only as bargaining chips that he was willing, if not necessarily happy, to negotiate away in return for the hard cash that was needed to fight his war to the death against France. This is the Royal Naval Hospital at Greenwich. Established in 1692, it celebrates William's first great victory over France. William had seized the chance to thrust his father-in-law from the throne, principally because he wanted English support in the Dutch war against France. But he soon found that such help was far from automatic, for the events of 1689 had changed the attitude of both parties in the English Parliament towards their monarch. Since the reign of Charles II, kings had known where they stood. The Tory half of the nation supported royal power, whilst the Whig opposed it. But the revolution of 1689, which had brought William to the throne, had muddied the waters. For the Whigs, whilst backing William's invasion, retained their traditional mistrust of royal power. On the other hand, the Tories, though they remained theoretically committed to monarchy, in their heart of hearts didn't really think that William was rightful king, and so, in practice, mistrusted him just as much as the Whigs. The result was that, divided in everything else, William's Parliament was united in its determination to drive a hard bargain with their new king. They knew that it was only their control over the purse strings that would force the king to call regular parliaments. Otherwise, as one MP put it, we should not do our duty to them that sent us hither. In personal conversations, William freely expressed his outrage at such apparent ingratitude. The Commons, he seethed, had used him like a dog. But William could achieve nothing without money, so he settled down to negotiate. First, he offered the Commons scrutiny of public accounts, so they could see where their money was going. Then he agreed to the Triennial Act, which ensured the summoning of a new parliament every 3 years, whether the king liked it or no. And finally, he yielded to Parliament control over both raising the money for the armed forces and over spending it. William had ceded powers to Parliament, which his royal predecessors would never have dreamt of giving up. Parliament repaid the favour in full. By 1694, they were voting an unprecedented £5 million a year for William's war. And every penny was needed, for the war which William was to declare against France within days of his coronation was the longest, largest, most expensive conflict in which England had engaged since the Middle Ages. The man who was to become its leading general, Marlborough, predicted that it would last forever. In sober fact, it was a new 100 Years' War whose outcome was not decided until the Congress of Vienna in 1815. The scale of the war and the taxation that it entailed completed the revolution of 1688-89 and made it permanent. And the results were literally set in stone. The Royal Hospital at Greenwich is only the first of William's great monuments, grander than any royal palace. It's a celebration of both England's naval greatness and, in its lavishly painted interiors, the glorious Revolution and William's own triumphs over France. But perhaps the most enduring monument to William's war machine is the Bank of England, established in 1694 to manage the government debt incurred in fighting the French war. Its security was not the king's personal credit, but the guaranteed steady income of parliamentary taxation that would prove the basis for Britain's future prosperity. But William's greatest achievement was his ability to make the relationship between monarch and parliament work for the first time in over a century. His pragmatism and tenacity laid the foundation stones of a truly modern state. But William, with so many great gifts, had few of the small ones which humanize greatness and make it popular, or at least bearable. He had no small talk. He suffered fools not at all, and he hated company, preferring instead to relax with a handful of his intimates here in his private dining room at Hampton Court, where, surrounded with paintings of the beauties of the court, they would get right royally drunk. For all his military successes in Europe, William was deeply unpopular in England. His intimacy with favoured household officials fueled rumours of homosexuality. He built himself a new private banqueting house in the grounds of the palace, but the friends he entertained there were all Dutch, and this the xenophobic English found intolerable. In terms of public relations, William was heavily dependent on his queen. Mary was tall, beautiful, and an able politician, with a natural charm and an easy gift of popularity. Above all, she was a Stuart. But in 1694, Mary died, aged only 32, of a virulent strain of smallpox, and the Stuart fig leaf was torn from William's throne. Without his wife's support, he found managing Parliament much more difficult. But thanks to his usual mixture of tenacity and flexibility, he coped. He coped too with mounting ill health until a sudden, unexpected event brought his life and reign to an end. Early in the spring of 1702, William was hunting here in Richmond Park when his favourite horse, Sorrel, stumbled at a molehill. William came off and broke his collarbone in the fall. chest infection set in. 2 weeks later, William was dead. His had been one of the most significant reigns in English history, a time when the very meaning of monarchy changed. But his death was little mourned. The Privy Council announced plans for a monument in the Abbey, but nobody could be bothered to build it, least of all his successor, Anne. Anne was 37. She was a Stuart, the younger of James II's daughters, and had never been considered a beauty, like her sister Mary. But she had a beautiful speaking voice, and above all, she knew how to rise to a public occasion. She wore a magnificent crimson robe, lined with ermine and bordered with gold. She blushed prettily, and she proclaimed in her thrilling voice that "I know my heart to be entirely English." The English, as pleased as she was to be rid of William, loved her for it, and from that moment she became and remained as popular as William had been disliked. Anne and William had never got on, but her first policy decision as Queen was one of which he would thoroughly have approved. For 4 years there had been peace with France, but events in Europe meant that it now looked as if the Spanish crown might fall into French hands. That would make William's old enemy, Louis XIV, easily the most powerful man in Europe once more. Just before his death, William had reassembled a grand alliance of nations to fight France. But the declaration of war was left to Anne. Louis is supposed to have replied mockingly that he must be old indeed, now that women made war on him. But, oddly enough, it was the fact that Anne was a woman which proved his downfall. For William, as was then customary, had acted as his own commander. This was a mixed blessing. William was brave to the point of foolhardiness, and he was indomitable, but he was no general. On the other hand, the man that Anne appointed to act in her stead was. Indeed, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, ranks with Caesar and Napoleon as one of the great generals. A master of the art of manoeuvre, Marlborough was to break with the lumbering siege warfare of the day and almost literally run rings round the French, revolutionizing the art of war in the process. But it's likely that Anne chose him as much for his wife's qualities as his own. Sarah Churchill had been a friend of Anne's since they were children. Anne was only 6 when her mother died and had soon been separated from her father also. In place of parental love, she enjoyed a series of intense friendships with other women. Much the most important and long-lasting was with Sarah Churchill, and the testimony to it is these countless letters they exchanged with each other under the levelling pseudonyms of Mrs. Freeman, Sarah, and Mrs. Morley, Anne. Back in 1692, Anne had broken irretrievably with William over her refusal to part with Sarah, to whom she pledged herself passionately in this letter. "No, my dear Mrs. Freeman, never believe your faithful Mrs. Morley will ever submit. She can wait with patience for a sunshine day, and if she does not live to see it, she hopes that England will flourish again." Now, with William's death, the sunshine day had arrived for Anne, England, and especially for the Churchills. Within weeks of Anne's accession, both John and Sarah had established positions of unrivaled influence. Sarah was made Groom of the Stole and head of the royal bedchamber. The office was known from its official symbol as the Key to the Monarch, and it controlled access to the Queen's private apartments, her robes and jewels, and her personal cash. At the same time, John was made Captain General, Master General of the Ordnance, and Ambassador Extraordinary to the Dutch Republic. Most importantly, he was now joint commander of the Anglo-Dutch alliance against France. He was an immediate success. In 1702, he freed the Dutch Republic from the French stranglehold. In 1704, he shattered the French threat to Austria, the other key member of the Grand Alliance, with the victory of Blenheim. The French commander was captured along with 13,000 of his men. It was England's greatest victory since Henry V's at Agincourt. Marlborough scribbled the news to Anne on the back of a tavern bill and was rewarded with a royal estate and a palace. Named after his great victory at Blenheim, every feature of this building memorialises Marlborough's triumphs. Most graphic is the great series of battle tapestries which hang in the sequence of formal drawing rooms. Ramillies, Oudenarde, Malplaquet, Bouchain, Lille. Marlborough and his army swept across northern Europe in one of the most successful military campaigns of British history. But while Marlborough was performing great feats of arms in Anne's name on the continent, there remained profound tensions in her British kingdoms, for the issue of the succession had reopened. Back in 1689, the radical implications of dethroning James II had been masked because it seemed it was likely that the Stuart line would continue in the persons of his daughters and their children. But it was not to be. For in 1700, Anne's last surviving child, a son, died. Loyalty to the House of Stuart now meant only one thing: the return of the Stuart male line, so temptingly near in exile in France. Spring 1703, England and her allies were at war with France under the command of the Duke of Marlborough. The French have a secret weapon, the exiled Stuart heir, the would-be King James III of England and 8th of Scotland. And in Scotland, feelings were running high. Would Marlborough have to break off from his continental campaign in order to subdue the rebellious northern kingdom? In March 1703, the Scots Parliament was opened with the customary riding. The mounted procession set out from Holyrood Palace and rode up the High Street, past the Canongate Kirk, towards St Giles's Cathedral and Parliament Square. First came the nobles in their robes, then the barons representing the shires, and finally the town burgesses. The members were accompanied by their armed retainers and rode through a lane of citizens, also armed, until they arrived at the Parliament House itself. The carrying of arms was traditional, but on this occasion, the atmosphere was feverish with barely suppressed real violence. Our swords were in our hands. At least our hands were at our swords, one leading member recalled. And the target of this impassioned feeling was England. For over a century, Scotland had shared a Stuart monarch with England, but they'd kept their own parliament and their own national interest, which frequently clashed with England's. Tensions between England and Scotland now reached boiling point. The Scots had a weapon to hand, the question of who would succeed Anne. Many in Highland Scotland, and some in England, felt allegiance toward James Edward Francis Stuart, the son and heir of James II, living in exile in France. The French had already recognised him as rightful king. But the English Parliament was determined not to have a Catholic. So, in 1701, they'd passed the Act of Settlement, which handed the succession to Sophia of Hanover and her eldest son, Georg. They were an improbable 50th and 51st in the line of succession, but they were the first Protestants on the list. But the English Parliament had passed the Act of Settlement without consulting the Scots. It was now the Scots' turn to play the English at their own game. The Scots Parliament of 1703 did so in the Act of Security here. This provided that, after Anne's death, the next monarch of Scotland should be a Protestant and of the royal line, but should not be the same person as the successor to the crown of England. The Act was deliberately provocative. Some saw it as an invitation to James Stuart to convert, others as a bid to extract commercial concessions from the English. But the hands of Anne and her English Parliament were tied. They couldn't afford to tangle with Scotland while still fighting a war with France. So, having delayed for over a year, Anne reluctantly gave her assent. But only 4 days after she did so, news reached London of the greatest of Marlborough's victories at Blenheim. Now, Anne and her English Parliament could respond robustly to the Scots' provocation. The result was the Aliens Act, passed in spring 1705. All Scots, except those resident in England, were to be treated as aliens, and all the major Scots export trades to England banned, unless, by Christmas 1705, significant progress had been made towards agreeing a union of the two kingdoms. Union had been discussed on and off over the years, but one country or the other had always had a reason to resist. But the Aliens Act hit the Scots where it hurt, in the pocket and in trade. It was enough to bring them to the table. Each Parliament now appointed a set of commissioners to try to thrash out an agreement in London. This wall is one of the few surviving fragments of the Palace of Whitehall, and it was here, in the building of which it once formed part, that in April 1706 the Union Commissioners began work. To avoid suspicion of collusion, the two sets of commissioners met in separate rooms, communicated only by written minutes, and strictly avoided socialising with each other. On the 22nd of April, the English room sent the following proposal to the Scottish: that the two kingdoms of England and Scotland be forever united into one kingdom by the name of Great Britain, that the United Kingdom of Great Britain be represented by one and the same Parliament, and that the succession to the monarchy of Great Britain be vested in the House of Hanover. On the 25th, the Scottish Commissioners came back with a counter-proposal. They would accept union and the Hanoverian succession, but on condition of freedom of trade. This was the key concession. The plantations or colonies, largely in North America, were the great English success story of the last 100 years. By Anne's reign, indeed, America seemed a separate realm, and appears symbolically as such below her statue outside St. Paul's. Access to this trading empire was very desirable, and up till now, the English had kept it to themselves. It had taken only 3 days to work out the bones of an agreement, for both sides had got what they wanted. The English wanted a Scotland unshakably on side during the war with France, whilst the Scots, whose own attempt to establish a colony in Central America had failed catastrophically, wanted free access to the English plantations as a way out of their own desperate national poverty. But the agreed Articles of Union had still to be ratified by the Parliament in London and in Edinburgh, where they were being asked to sign their own death warrant. Within the Scots Parliament, the promise of free trade with the colonies, helped along with a generous dollop of bribery, had begun to create a majority for union. But outside, in the streets, there was widespread and often violent hostility, and at times it seemed an open question which side would win. However, on the 16th of January 1707, after 3 months of clause-by-clause debate, the Scots Parliament voted decisively by 110 to 67 for union and its own extinction. The bells of St. Giles's are said to have rung out with the tune, "Why am I so sad on this my wedding day?" And across Scotland, few celebrated the Union. There was unrest in Edinburgh and riots in Glasgow, which were caused both by patriotism and a fear that England would still keep Scotland a poor relation. But, as the transformation of 18th century Scotland would show, the Scots benefited hugely from union and access to the colonies. From a small, if thriving town, Glasgow grew rapidly into one of the great commercial cities of the British Empire. In London, the Union was marked by a day of grand celebration, and for Anne, yet another great ceremonial visit to St. Paul's. Not since Elizabeth I had a monarch so understood the value of public royal spectacle or been so loved by her people. So, on the 1st of May 1707, Anne came to the great cathedral, accompanied by 400 coaches and wearing the combined orders of the English Garter and the Scottish Thistle. It was, she told her cheering subjects, the day that would prove the true happiness of her reign. The day that England and Scotland became the United Kingdom of Great Britain. But for all the public achievement, in private Anne found happiness increasingly elusive. After decades of intimacy, her close friendship with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, was beginning to cool. The private squabble had a political origin. Sarah had campaigned vigorously against the leading Tories, whom she accused of being secret supporters of the exiled Stuarts. But Anne, keen to preserve her freedom of action between the competing political parties, had refused to remove the Tories and resented Sarah's bullying attempts to make her do so. The result was that Sarah's company became increasingly disagreeable to the Queen, who transferred her affections instead to Sarah's cousin, Abigail Masham, a lowly bedchamber woman. Sarah, outraged in turn, accused the Queen, in barely concealed terms, of lesbianism. She showed Anne a ballad ridiculing Abigail's position in Anne's household. Her secretary she was not, because she could not write, but had the conduct and the care of some dark deeds at night. True or not, it was an appalling insult. For 2 months, the two women did not speak. Then they were forced to share a coach on the way to St. Paul's for yet another service of celebration. En route, the two women had a terrible quarrel, because Anne, who hated cumbrous clothing, had refused to wear the rich and heavy jewels which Sarah, as groom of the stole, had put out for her to wear. As they stepped out of the coach, Sarah hissed, "Be quiet," to the Queen, lest, she claimed, others overheard their quarrel. Anne never forgave the insult to majesty, and it was all over between them. This rupture in Anne's personal relationships had serious consequences. Sarah's loss of favour at court cast a dark shadow over Marlborough's own position as commander of the Allied forces, and it came at a critical time, for Anne, along with much of the nation, was becoming sick of the war, the deaths and the spiralling taxation. The turning point was Marlborough's Battle of Malplaquet, the first time the war had been fought on French soil. It was an English victory of sorts, but the casualties were enormous, 8,000 British dead, and the French, faced with the invasion of their own soil, dug their heels in to fight a patriotic war. Marlborough's reaction was to demand the Captain Generalship for life, like Oliver Cromwell. Anne's was to exclaim, "When will this bloodshed ever cease?" and to decide that Marlborough must go. He was dismissed in December 1711, and his Whig supporters in government replaced by a Tory ministry that was determined to negotiate a unilateral peace with France. Negotiations were opened, and after 9 years of warfare, agreement quickly reached. To Britain's allies, including the Elector of Hanover, this was a gross betrayal. Peace with France was formally agreed at Utrecht in 1713 and celebrated with another grand Thanksgiving service in St. Paul's. And there was much to celebrate, since the peace marked Britain's eclipse of the two powers which, only half a century before, had overshadowed her. Britain was now more powerful militarily than France, and more commercially successful than the Netherlands. A time for celebration indeed, but the poor health which prevented Anne from attending the Thanksgiving didn't go unnoticed, and London was soon fizzing with speculation about the succession to the throne. This statue of Anne was erected within a year of peace with France. Soon after Anne, still aged only 49, fell dangerously ill. She'd been the most popular monarch since Elizabeth I, a queen whose reign had seen England become the greatest power in Europe, and who had brought England and Scotland together as Great Britain. But as she lay dying, all anyone cared about was who would succeed her. Finally, on the 1st of August 1714, good Queen Anne died in this room in Kensington Palace. The two principal claimants to her crown were both several hundred miles from London, Georg Ludwig in Hanover and James Stuart in France, under the protection of Louis XIV. If he'd made a dash for it, James could have given the Hanoverian a run for his money. But for all that he was only 28, James III did not do dashing. But neither did Georg. Instead, correctly confident in the machinery of the Act of Settlement, he anglicised his name to George and spent 6 long weeks making a stately progress towards England. He landed at Greenwich on the 18th of September at 6 p.m. Then, accompanied by his eldest son, George Augustus, and a great crowd of nobles, gentry, and common folk, he walked through the great colonnades and courtyards of the Royal Naval Hospital to the Queen's house here in the park, where he spent his first night in England. Whilst George and his German advisors prepared for his coronation, James Stuart lingered on in France. It would be up to his supporters to go it alone without him. In the late summer of 1715, the Earl of Mar raised the Stuart standard at Braemar in the Highlands and rallied the clans to the Stuart cause. The newly formed Jacobite army began to march across Scotland, soon taking Perth, but coming to a halt before the small British force garrisoning the key stronghold of Stirling. They finally confronted each other at Sheriff Muir, just a few miles from the fortress. The battle was long and bloody, and strangely inconclusive. At the end of it, no one was really sure who'd won. But in France, it was represented as a great victory for the Jacobites, and James finally set sail for Scotland. At first, it was a triumphal progress. The magistrates of Aberdeen paid him homage. He made a state entry into Dundee, and then he came here to Scone Palace. He even issued a proclamation announcing the date of his forthcoming coronation as King James VIII and III, here on Moot Hill in the grounds of Scone Palace, the ancient coronation site of the King of Scots. But after this good start, things quickly began to crumble. For James, with his shy, cold public manner, was unable to keep the loyalty of his existing followers, let alone recruit new ones. James's dream was fading fast. His soldiers were beginning to desert him, and, worst of all, his great ally and patron, Louis XIV, had died. There would be no more money or men coming from France. On the 30th of January, as the government forces marched towards them through the winter snow, James's retinue moved from Scone back to Perth. The following morning, they abandoned the city, marching horses and men across the frozen River Tay on their way back to the coast at Montrose. On the night of the 4th of February, 1716, James secretly set sail for France, escaping the warships which had been sent to intercept him and abandoning his army to their fate. He never saw Britain again. Through his dithering, his failure to inspire his men, and his refusal to give up his Catholicism, James had thrown away the Stuarts' best chance to regain the British throne. 30 years later, his grandson Charles, known to history as Bonnie Prince Charlie, would give it another, bolder go, a venture that came to a bitter end on the battlefield of Culloden. No Stuart would ever again wear the crown, nor would any British king revert to that Stuart vision of monarchy as absolute and divinely inspired. Among disaffected Scots, the Stuart cause would slip into the realm of romance, a realm in which tragic failure constituted much of its allure. The propaganda dispersed on behalf of the Hanoverian regime was altogether more robustly confident. The arrival of George I is commemorated here in Greenwich, just a few paces from where he actually landed. But that's the only realistic thing about the painting, which shows George arriving in a triumphal chariot led by the symbolic figure of Liberty with her cap. It's painted in shades of grey to imitate a Roman sculpture relief, and St. George's slain dragon is being trampled underfoot. The reality had been very different, however, as the painter, James Thornhill, who was present as an eyewitness and shows himself here as such, well knew. It was night. George's dress was wholly inadequate to the occasion, and most of the receiving nobles were Tory, which was the wrong political party. Hence, Thornhill explains his decision to go instead for high-flown allegory. the sober reality had been right, of course. George was a modest man and would preside over a modest monarchy. Parliament had brought him to the throne, and Protestantism would keep him there. The crown which George had inherited had been utterly transformed under his immediate predecessors. The reigns of William and Mary and Queen Anne are little remembered today, but they are amongst the most significant in English history. In a single generation, Britain had freed herself from political and religious absolutism, and in so doing had freed herself for the most rapid expansion of any European power since Rome. At the root of this success was the Glorious Revolution. The religious settlement and union with Scotland meant that energies which had been devoted to civil war could turn outward to European war and overseas expansion. The new financial system provided money not only for war, but also to generate economic growth at home, whilst economic growth made for a society that was richer, more diverse, and, above all, vastly more curious intellectually than ever before. It was a virtuous circle. In just 25 years, England and her monarchy had discovered their own route to modernity and had become Great Britain along the way.